I never imagined my life could turn upside down so quickly. It was an ordinary morning, like any other, until I received a message from my boss, Mr. Thompson, asking me to come to his office immediately. I thought it would just be another routine meeting, perhaps to discuss the progress of our latest software project. Little did I know that that would be the beginning of my nightmare. As I entered Thompson's office, I felt a heavy atmosphere in the air. He was sitting behind his desk, with a serious expression on his face, and next to him was the Director of Human Resources, Mrs. Collins. Her presence there was already a bad sign. I could feel my heart start to beat faster. "Nate, sit down," Thompson said, his voice deep and distant. I sat down, trying to stay calm, but anxiety was starting to get the best of me. "Nate, we have received a very serious complaint against you," Mrs. Collins began. "You are being accused of intellectual property theft." I was shocked. "What? That's absurd. I would never do such a thing." My voice was louder than I intended, but I was really outraged. Thompson shook his head, as if expecting that reaction. "Nate, we have found evidence that you downloaded confidential files without authorization and transferred them to an external device. We are investigating the source of the report, but in the meantime, you are suspended effective immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This is a misunderstanding. I've been loyal to this company for years. Someone must have planted this evidence. Mrs. Collins tried to sound understanding, but I could see the decision had already been made. "Nate, we understand this is difficult for you, but we need to follow protocols. Please hand over your badge and any company devices in your possession." I handed over my badge and laptop with shaking hands. News of my suspension spread quickly throughout the company, and I could feel the judgmental looks and whispers as I left the building. My reputation was in ruins, and it seemed like everyone believed I was guilty. Desperate and not knowing what to do, I went home and tried to reorganize my thoughts. Who could be behind this? I had no declared enemies, but I remembered some colleagues who might envy my success. I decided I couldn't sit idly by. He needed to investigate on his own and discover the truth. I picked up my phone and called my ex-girlfriend, Sarah Williams. She was a talented lawyer and one of the few people I still trusted. After a few rings, she answered. "Sarah, it's me, Nate. I need your help. I was wrongly accused of stealing intellectual property at the company." On the other end of the line, I heard a sigh. "Nate, this is serious. Are you sure you didn't do anything that could be misinterpreted?" "Yes, Sarah. You know my character. This is some kind of setup, and I don't know what to do." She was silent for a moment, pondering. "Okay, Nate. Can we meet tomorrow at my office? I'll see what I can do to help you." I agreed, feeling a little relief. I knew the journey to prove my innocence wouldn't be easy, but at least I wouldn't be alone. With Sarah by my side, I had a chance to unravel this plot and clear my name. When I found myself trapped by the unfair accusation of intellectual property theft, I knew I needed help. Sitting in the living room of my small apartment, my mind was racing a mile a minute, trying to find a way out. Then I thought about Sarah Williams, my ex-girlfriend and brilliant lawyer. We hadn't spoken in years, since our lives took different paths. But at that moment, she was the only person I could trust. I picked up the phone and dialed his number, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. The phone rang a few times before she picked it up. His voice was serious, but still familiar. "Nate? What happened? It's been so long since we last spoke." "Sarah, I'm in trouble. I've been accused of stealing intellectual property at the company. I'm suspended and I don't know what to do. I need your help." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could imagine Sarah processing the information, weighing her options. "Nate, you know I have a busy schedule. I have important cases and a lot of pressure here at the office." Her arguments were valid, but I needed to convince her. My voice was firmer than I expected. "I understand, Sarah. But I'm innocent. Someone is setting me up and I don't know where to start." If you help me find out the truth, I know we can solve this together." She sighed, and I could almost see her rubbing her forehead, an old habit when she was deep in thought. "Okay, Nate. Let's meet in my office first thing tomorrow. We need to talk in person and get a better understanding of what's going on." The next day, I walked into the elegant law office where Sarah worked. She greeted me with a restrained smile, but her eyes showed concern. I told him everything I knew, every detail of the accusation and my suspicions. "We need to start with the basics," she said, grabbing a notepad. "Let's dig through the company documents and talk to some people. Someone must know something." We spent the next few days diving into piles of documents, analyzing each line for inconsistencies. Sarah, with her analytical mind and legal skills, was instrumental in identifying patterns that I would never have noticed on my own. Additionally, we began interviewing coworkers, trying to find out who might have motives to incriminate me. During one of these interviews, I spoke with Jim, a longtime colleague. He looked nervous, avoiding my gaze. "Jim, do you know anything that could help me?" "Anything could be important." He hesitated before responding. "Nate, I've heard rumors that Mark Stevens is very close to the directors. He's always envied you, and maybe that has something to do with that." I shared this information with Sarah, who frowned. "Mark has always been a rival, but we need concrete proof. Let's focus on him for now, but without leaving aside other possibilities." Our investigations began to point to Mark, but also revealed something more sinister. Sarah managed to access some emails that suggested a connection between Mark and Richard Hayes, a businessman known for his shady practices. "Nate, this is getting more complicated. It looks like Mark isn't acting alone. Richard Hayes could be behind this, and he's a big fish. We need to be careful." The determination in Sarah's eyes gave me the strength to continue. She was committed to the case. Even though she faced pressure at the law firm. Her superiors weren't happy with the time she was dedicating to my problem, but Sarah didn't let that faze her. "Nate, I'll do everything in my power to help you. Let's unmask these guys together." Those words were a relief. I knew that with Sarah by my side, I had a real chance of proving my innocence and unmasking the real culprits. And so, our journey for truth continued, closer and closer to unraveling the complex web of lies and conspiracies that threatened to destroy my life. During the investigation, I began to realize that things were even more complicated than I could have imagined. Sarah and I spent hours reviewing documents, analyzing emails, and chatting with colleagues. It was in one of these conversations that a clue began to emerge: the name of Mark Stevens. Mark has always been an intriguing figure in the company. He had a history of envy and resentment toward my success. There was something about him that always made me uncomfortable, but I never imagined he could be involved in something so serious. We decided it was time to confront him. "Sarah, we need to talk to Mark," I said, exasperated after yet another sleuthing session without much progress. "He always looked at me the wrong way, and I think he might be behind all of this." Sarah agreed, albeit with a wary expression. "Let's do this smart, Nate. We can't just accuse him without hard evidence. We need something that implicates him directly." We arranged to meet with Mark under the guise of discussing an ongoing project. When we met in the company cafeteria, I tried to remain calm, but the tension was palpable. Sarah, ever the professional, began the conversation smoothly. "Mark, we're reviewing some documents and found some inconsistencies. Could you help us understand what's going on?" she asked, as she slid a set of papers towards him. Mark looked at the documents and then at us, visibly disconcerted. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know anything about that." I couldn't contain myself. "Mark, we know you've always wanted my position. It's clear you have something to do with these accusations. Why are you doing this?" Mark blushed but maintained his composure. "Nate, I don't know what you're talking about. This is ridiculous. I would never do something like that." The tension was increasing by the second, and I could see that we were at an impasse. It was then that Sarah suggested a different approach. "Mark, we're all in the same boat here. If there's something going on, you better tell us now. There could be more powerful people involved, and we need to know that before it's too late. That was the key. Mark hesitated, looked around to see if anyone was listening, and then whispered, "Okay, I'll tell you what I know." "But you didn't hear that from me." Mark's revelation was shocking. He confessed that he had been approached by Richard Hayes, an unscrupulous businessman, who wanted to use confidential information to blackmail him and force him to frame me. Richard had bigger plans, a fraudulent merger that would give him control over our company. Richard promised me a promotion and a generous bonus if I cooperated, Mark admitted, clearly uncomfortable. But I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted a chance to prove myself. I was stunned. The plot was much deeper than I imagined. Sarah immediately began to formulate a plan. "Mark, you need to help us take down Richard. If you cooperate, we can guarantee that you won't be framed. But we need solid evidence." Sarah spoke firmly, making it clear that this was the best option for everyone. Mark agreed, visibly relieved to have someone by his side. He provided us with emails and documents that proved the connection between him and Richard. With this new information, our investigation gained new momentum. "Nate, we're getting close. We need to follow this lead to the end," Sarah said with determination. I nodded, feeling a new wave of hope. "Let's do this. I won't rest until the truth is revealed and my reputation is restored." With Mark's help, we began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Each new discovery brought us closer to the truth, and I knew we were on the right path to unmasking Richard and clearing my name once and for all. The phone rang for the third time that morning, and I knew it was something important. I looked at the caller ID and saw my boss's name, Robert. I sighed, knowing the conversation would be about Nate's case. "Sarah, I need to speak to you immediately," Robert said bluntly, as soon as I answered. "Of course, Robert. I'm going to your office right now," I replied, trying to hide the anxiety in my voice. I walked down the hallway with steady steps, but my mind was racing. Ever since I agreed to help Nate, I knew I would face resistance at the office. The firm was involved in high-profile, highly lucrative cases, and a self-defense case like Nate's wasn't exactly a priority for upper management. As soon as I walked into Robert's office, he got straight to the point. "Sarah, you know we value your work here. You are one of our best lawyers. But you need to understand that this Nate Parker case is not bringing any benefit to the firm," he said, looking at me with a serious face. "I understand, Robert, but Nate is innocent. And as a lawyer, my duty is to seek truth and justice, even if it isn't necessarily profitable," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. Robert sighed and shook his head. "It's not just about money, Sarah. We are talking about the firm's resources, time, energy. There are more important cases that need your attention. Big corporations, million-dollar contracts. You are compromising all of this for a single customer." I looked at him, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I knew he was right, but I also knew I couldn't abandon Nate. "Robert, Nate is my friend. I believe him. If I don't help him, who will? He is being unfairly accused, and it could ruin his life." He watched me for a few seconds, gauging my determination. "Sarah, let's be realistic. If you continue this affair, there may be consequences. I'm not just talking about losing the opportunity to work on bigger cases. I'm talking about your position here. The firm has expectations, and you know it." I was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of Robert's words. I knew he was giving me an ultimatum. Abandon Nate or risk my career. "I need to think about this," I finally said, feeling the pressure increasing with each second. I went back to my office, closed the door, and sat at my desk, trying to process the conversation. My mind was torn between professional duty and loyalty to Nate. At that moment, my phone rang again, and it was Nate. "Sarah, I discovered something new about Mark Stevens. I think he might be more involved than we think," Nate said, his voice thick with tension. "Nate, I need to be honest with you. I'm facing a lot of pressure here at the office to drop your case. They're asking me to focus on more profitable cases and leave this aside, I confessed, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I finally said it out loud. I understand, Sarah. I don't want you to sacrifice your career for me. If you need to leave the case, I will understand. But know that I have no one else to trust, he replied, with a sincerity that broke my heart. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. I knew Nate needed me, and I knew it was the right thing to do. Nate, I won't abandon you. Let's get on with this together. I just need to figure out a way to deal with the pressure here at the office, I said, feeling a new wave of determination wash over me. Thank you, Sarah. It means a lot to me, he replied, with noticeable relief in his voice. I hung up the phone and looked out the window, taking a deep breath. I knew I was facing an ethical and professional dilemma, but I also knew that my conscience wouldn't allow me to abandon Nate. I needed to find a way to balance the firm's expectations with my dedication to proving his innocence. With this decision made, I felt a new inner strength. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it, for the sake of justice and for the friendship she still had for Nate. When I discovered that my technology had been sold to a competing company, I felt like a solid ground had been lifted from beneath my feet. Anger and frustration mixed with the feeling of betrayal. I knew I was dealing with something much bigger than a simple accusation of intellectual property theft. However, this revelation also ignited a fire of determination in me. I couldn't allow them to get away with it. I decided to meet with Sarah immediately to discuss this new discovery. We went to a quiet cafe in the city center. The environment was welcoming, but my mind was racing. Sarah, I discovered something big, I said, trying to remain calm. My technology was sold to Tech Innovate, Richard Hayes' company. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. Richard Hayes? He is known for his unscrupulous practices. This explains a lot. She paused, thoughtfully. We need to connect the dots between Mark Stevens and Richard Hayes. If we can prove that they are working together, we can unmask this conspiracy. We spent hours in that cafe, going through documents, emails, and files that I managed to recover. The connections slowly began to unfold. We found records of communication between Mark and Richard that included specific technical terms related to my project. It was clear that Mark had passed confidential information to Richard. One night, while we were working in Sarah's office, she suddenly stopped and looked at me with a worried expression. Nate, this could be dangerous. Richard Hayes is not the type of person who accepts being exposed without a fight. We need to be careful. I knew she was right, but I couldn't back down now. I know, Sarah. But I have no choice. I have to prove my innocence and protect my invention. And, of course, you are also at risk. If you want to get out of this, I understand. Sarah shook her head, determined. No, Nate. We're in this together. Let's go until the end. From that moment on, our investigation intensified. We began following the money trail, tracking suspicious financial transactions that linked Mark to Richard. We discovered that there were periodic payments from an offshore account to Mark, coincidentally, shortly after the sale of my technology. One night, as we were reviewing financial data, Sarah found something crucial. Nate, look at this. She exclaimed, pointing to the computer screen. Payments to Mark coincide exactly with the dates when major advances were made in his project. This cannot be a coincidence. That's the proof we need. I smiled, feeling momentary relief. But we still need to tie up all the loose ends. We decided it was time to confront Mark. We knew he was meeting Richard regularly, so we planned to intercept him after one of these meetings. It was a risky move, but we needed to catch Mark by surprise. On the day of the meeting, we followed Mark to a discreet restaurant where he and Richard often met. We waited until Richard left, leaving Mark alone. I entered the restaurant, accompanied by Sarah, and we went directly to his table. Mark, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, surprised and nervous. Nate, what are you doing here? We know everything, Mark. We know you sold my technology to Richard Hayes. We have proof, Sarah intervened, placing a thick dossier on the table. Mark looked at the documents, pale. He knew he was cornered. I had no choice. Richard forced me. He had something against me, he confessed, his voice trembling. So, you're going to help us take him down, I said, with no room for negotiation. Let's expose this conspiracy and clear my name. Mark, now visibly remorseful, agreed to help us. He provided more information linking Richard to other scams, which gave us a solid foundation to move forward. The discovery that my technology had been sold to Richard Hayes' company was a crucial turning point. Not only did it give us the clue we needed to connect Mark and Richard, it also strengthened my resolve to fight to the end. With Sarah by my side and Mark now collaborating, we were closer to unmasking the truth and exposing the intricate web of lies and betrayal that threatened my life and career. When I discovered that my younger brother, Dylan, was getting involved in questionable activities, I felt the ground open beneath my feet. I was already up to my neck in the unfair accusation of intellectual property theft and the complex investigation that Sarah and I were conducting. Now, he still had to deal with the Dylan problem. It was too much for one person. You what? I asked in disbelief, after Dylan finally confessed. I was desperate, Nate, he replied, visibly dejected. I just wanted to help pay the household bills. I thought it would be something quick, that no one would notice. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Dylan, you have no idea what you're doing. These people you've gotten involved with, they're no joke. And now, with everything that's happening to me, this just makes the situation even more complicated. He lowered his head, clearly regretful. I know, and I'm sorry. But I need your help. I don't know how to get out of this. I couldn't just turn my back on him. Dylan was my brother, and despite all our problems, family came first. But at the same time, helping Dylan meant putting my already fragile position even more at risk. I told Sarah the situation that night. She looked at me with a mixture of concern and frustration. Nate, this is serious. If Dylan is involved with dangerous people, we need to act quickly. But how are we going to do this without compromising our investigation? I know, Sarah. I'm trying to think of a way to deal with this. But my hands are tied. I can't just let Dylan wallow in this. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. We're going to need help. Maybe we can involve someone from the police, someone we can trust, who understands the situation and can help us without exposing Dylan too much. I agreed, but the idea of involving the police made me nervous. It was hard enough to prove my innocence without attracting more attention to my family. But Sarah was right. We needed support. We decided to speak to a private detective Sarah knew, someone discreet and trustworthy. The meeting was scheduled for the following day. When we met with the detective, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and an air of authority, I explained the entire situation. Nate, Sarah, this isn't going to be easy, he said after hearing our story. But I'm going to do what I can to help. First, we need to identify exactly who Dylan is involved with and what these people want. From there, we can come up with a plan to get him out of this. As the detective began his work, I tried to stay focused on the main investigation. But it was difficult. Every time I thought about Dylan, fear and guilt consumed me. And Sarah's pressure at the law firm didn't help. His superiors were becoming increasingly impatient with his dedication to my case. Nate, we need a breakthrough, she told me one night, exhausted. I'm losing my boss's trust. If we don't get something concrete soon, he'll force me to drop the case. I knew she was sacrificing a lot for me. We'll make it, Sarah. I'm sure. I can't do this without you. And then one night, when we least expected it, the detective called. Nate, Sarah, I found something. Dylan is involved with a group that has connections to Richard Hayes. This could be the missing piece that ties everything together. My heart raced. Let's meet. We need to discuss how to proceed. That night, As we gathered to plot our next move, I realized I was closer to the truth than I had ever been. But he also knew that the path ahead would be even more dangerous. I was about to face not only the conspiracy that was trying to take me down, but also Dylan's enemies. And failure was not an option. "Nate," Sarah said, holding my hand. "We'll get through this. Together." I looked at her, feeling a surge of gratitude and determination. "Come on, Sarah. Let's prove my innocence and protect Dylan. No matter what." As Sarah and I continued the investigation, a startling revelation struck us like lightning from a clear sky. Mark was not the true villain, but rather a puppet manipulated by Richard Hayes. The discovery came one night when we were reviewing confidential documents in Sarah's living room. "Nate, look at this," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen. "These emails between Mark and Richard. They're not just small talk. Richard was blackmailing Mark. Like this?" I leaned over the table, trying to absorb the magnitude of the revelation. "Mark has a secret that Richard discovered. Something big enough to make him act against you." My mind started racing, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. That explains why Mark was so determined to frame me. He had no choice. Sarah nodded. "We need to find out what exactly Richard has on Mark. This could be the key to unmasking the entire scheme." We decided that the best way to obtain more information would be to infiltrate Richard's competing company deeper. We use our contacts and resources to access confidential records and documents. It was an exhausting phase of the investigation, with long nights and busy days. But we were determined to find out the truth. One night, as we were reviewing a series of financial documents, Sarah found something that could be the breaking point. "Nate, I think I found it. Look at this," she said, pointing to a detailed financial report. Richard diverted company funds to an offshore account. And it appears that Mark signed some of these documents under duress. "That's perfect," I said, feeling a surge of hope. "If we can prove that Mark was coerced, we can use him as a witness against Richard." We decided to confront Mark directly. We arranged to meet at a discreet cafe outside the city. When he arrived, he seemed tense, but also curious. "Nate, Sarah, why did you want to meet me here?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Mark, we know you're being blackmailed by Richard," I said directly. "We have proof that he is using confidential information to force you to frame me." Mark went pale. He looked around, as if looking for a way out. I don't know what they're talking about." "Mark, please," Sarah intervened, her voice firm but compassionate. "We can help you, but you need to be honest with us. We know Richard is manipulating you. If you cooperate, we can take Richard down together." There was a tense silence. Mark finally gave in, the resistance in his eyes disappearing. "You're right. Richard found out that I embezzled a small amount from the company a few years ago. He threatened me with it. He said he would ruin my career and my family if I didn't cooperate. We need you to help us prove this," I said. "If you testify against Richard, we can make sure you are treated fairly." Mark looked relieved and terrified at the same time. "I'll do whatever it takes. Richard needs to be stopped." With Mark's collaboration, we were able to further our investigation into Richard's company. We uncover more documents implicating Richard in a range of illegal activities, from financial fraud to corporate espionage. The corruption plot was deeper than we imagined. "We have to be careful now," Sarah said, as we reviewed our plan. "Richard isn't going down without a fight." "I know," I replied, feeling the adrenaline rising. "But we're close to unmasking him. We can't give up now." With Mark's help, we began to build a complete and irrefutable dossier against Richard. Tension was in the air, but Sarah's determination and my own desire for justice drove us forward. We were ready for the final showdown, knowing that the fate of my career and the truth were at stake. Confronting Mark was one of the most intense experiences of my life. Sarah and I knew we were about to enter dangerous territory, but we also knew we had no choice. We gathered all the evidence we had up to that point, emails, recordings of conversations and documents that compromised both Mark and Richard Hayes. Armed with this evidence, we arranged to meet Mark at a discreet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the company. When we arrived, Mark was already there, sitting in a secluded corner. His face showed a mixture of nervousness and resignation. We sat down at the table, and Sarah got straight to the point. "Mark, we know what you did," she said, sliding a folder full of evidence toward him. "We have all the evidence we need to prove your participation in the theft of intellectual property and the conspiracy to take down Nate." Mark looked at the folder, then at me. His expression hardened, and he tried to maintain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice shaking slightly. "You know exactly what we're talking about," I said, trying to remain calm. "Richard Hayes manipulated you, and now you're at a dead end. This is your chance to do the right thing." There was a long silence. Mark looked down, eyes fixed on the table. Finally, he sighed deeply and began to speak. "Okay, you win. I was part of this, but it wasn't my idea. Richard pressured me, used confidential information against me. I had no choice." Sarah and I exchanged glances. Even though we knew Mark was involved, hearing his confession was an unexpected relief. "We need more details," Sarah said. "What is Richard planning? And why does he want to take Nate down so badly?" Mark hesitated for a moment, but then began to speak, revealing an even more sinister plan. "Richard doesn't just want to overthrow Nate. He wants to take control of the entire company through a fraudulent merger. He plans to manipulate shareholders and use stolen technology to increase the value of the competing company, facilitating the merger." My head spun with this new information. Richard's plan was even more ambitious and dangerous than I imagined. "So, you're going to help us take down Richard?" I asked, my voice thick with urgency. Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, but you need to guarantee my safety. Richard is a powerful man, and he won't hesitate to silence me if he finds out I'm collaborating with you." Sarah assured Mark that we would do everything we could to protect him. With Mark now on our side, we began to hatch a plan to unmask Richard. We needed more evidence, and most of all, we needed a perfect moment to lay it all out. "We will prepare a complete dossier," said Sarah. "And we're going to present this at the next shareholder meeting. It's the only way to make sure everyone knows the truth, and that Richard doesn't have time to react." Mark agreed to provide us with all the inside information he had, including details about Richard's financial operations and communications. We spent days and nights analyzing documents and building our case. Each new discovery brought a mix of relief and tension. We were about to face a corporate giant, and any mistake could be fatal. During one of these sessions, Sarah looked at me and said, "Nate, we're doing the right thing. We're going to expose these guys and clear their names." I smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I would do without you." Finally, with all the pieces in place, we were ready for the final showdown. The shareholder meeting would be our last chance to expose Richard Hayes and save the company. And with Mark's help, we were more determined than ever to seek justice. Anxiety was eating away at me as Sarah and I prepared for the shareholder meeting. Mark had proven to be a crucial part of our plan, providing valuable information that helped us put together a dossier full of evidence against Richard Hayes. Despite all our efforts, the tension was palpable. Sarah, noticing my nervousness, tried to reassure me. "Nate, it's going to be okay. We have everything we need to unmask Richard," she said, holding my hand tightly. "I know, Sarah. But it's hard not to be nervous when my whole life is at stake," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. The moment of truth was approaching. The shareholder meeting would be the perfect stage to expose Richard and his corruption network. I was determined to prove my innocence and clear my name once and for all. Sarah and I went through the dossier once again, checking every detail, every piece of evidence, every testimony. We were ready, at least on paper. When we arrived at the auditorium, the atmosphere was full of expectation. Richard was on stage, smiling and confident, ready to announce the fraudulent merger he had planned. Sarah and I strategically positioned ourselves in the audience, waiting for the right moment to make our move. Richard's presentation began with exaggerated pomp. He talked about growth, innovation, and how the merger would be beneficial for all shareholders. I could feel the anger building inside me, but I remained calm. Sarah gave me a slight nod, signaling that it was time. "Excuse me, Richard," I interrupted, rising from my chair. "Before you continue, I think everyone here needs to see something very important." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the surprise and irritation on his face. "What is this, Parker?" "This is a serious business meeting," he said, trying to maintain control. "Yes, and that's exactly why everyone here needs to know the truth," I replied, heading to the stage with Sarah at my side. We connected our laptop to the projector and started displaying the dossier. The evidence was irrefutable: financial documents, compromising emails, suspicious bank transfers. With each slide that passed, Richard's expression became darker. "This is a hoax. None of it is true," Richard shouted, trying to discredit our evidence. "Ah, but it's true, Richard," Sarah interjected firmly. "And we have witnesses to confirm all of this." At that moment, Mark entered the room, followed by other colleagues who had also been victims of Richard's maneuvers. They corroborated each of our accusations, causing the tension in the room to reach its peak. And then, to my utter surprise, my brother Dylan showed up. He held a flash drive in his hand and walked towards the microphone. "I have something to add," Dylan said, looking directly at me. "This contains crucial information linking Richard to other financial crimes. It's time to put an end to this once and for all." Dylan's revelation was the final straw. The room erupted in murmurs and heated arguments. The shareholders were in shock, and Richard was no longer able to defend himself. The police, who Sarah had previously alerted, entered the room to arrest Richard on the spot. As Richard was led away, I couldn't help but feel a rush of relief and justice. Sarah hugged me tight, and I knew we had won. "Nate, we did it. You're free," she whispered in my ear. "Yes, we did it. Thank you, Sarah." "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, feeling a mixture of gratitude and admiration for her. The meeting ended with my official dismissal and the promise of a promotion. Finally, my life was getting back on track. And, most importantly, the truth had prevailed. On the day of the shareholder meeting, I woke up with a mix of anxiety and determination. I knew that would be the decisive moment, the turning point that would define not only my career, but also my personal life and my future. I put on my most elegant suit and went to meet Sarah. She was already waiting in the office, with a stack of documents and a determined look. "Are you ready for this, Nate?" Sarah asked, looking directly into my eyes. "More than ever," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. "Do we have everything we need?" "We do, but remember, we need to be precise and direct. Richard Hayes isn't going down without a fight," she warned. We entered the meeting room, where the main shareholders were already gathered. Richard was there, with his usual air of superiority, ready to announce the fraudulent merger he had planned. I felt my stomach drop, but I maintained my composure. The moment of revelation was near. When Richard started to speak, Sarah raised her hand, interrupting him. "Excuse me, Richard, but before we continue, we have some important information that needs to be shared with everyone here," said Sarah, with a calmness that impressed me. "What are you talking about, Sarah?" Richard looked at her with disdain. "This meeting is to discuss the merger, not interruptions." "Exactly what we want to talk about." I stood up, feeling the weight of responsibility in every word. "We have evidence that this merger is based on fraud and corruption." The room fell silent as Sarah and I began to present the documents. We showed emails, recordings, and financial transactions that linked Richard to a network of corruption. Each piece of evidence was a stab at the immaculate image he tried to maintain. "This is absurd. Richard shouted, visibly shaken. This evidence is forged. It was then that the door to the meeting room opened, and Dylan, my brother, hurriedly entered. Wait! He exclaimed, carrying a bulky folder. I have more information linking Richard to other financial crimes. Dylan began presenting documents that showed embezzlement and market manipulation, connecting Richard to an even larger web of illegalities. Richard's expression changed from anger to panic. This is unacceptable. Richard tried to get up, but two bailiffs, who had been previously informed, entered the room and detained him. Richard Hayes, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement and conspiracy, one of the officers announced as he placed handcuffs on Richard. The room erupted in murmurs. The shareholders were stunned, and I felt immediate relief. Sarah looked at me and smiled, a smile that said we did it. Mark, who was present, stood up and, with a contrite look, began to speak. I participated in this scheme, but I was manipulated and blackmailed by Richard. I am willing to cooperate fully to correct my mistakes, he said, and the sincerity in his voice was palpable. After the meeting, I was exonerated of all charges. My reputation was restored, and, to my surprise, I received a promotion. The company recognized my integrity and commitment, and I finally felt that justice had been served. Nate, you deserve this, Sarah said as we walked out of the building. I knew you were innocent from the beginning. Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done this without you, I replied, with true gratitude. Maybe we can start over, Nate. As friends, at least. She suggested, with a hopeful gleam in her eyes. I would love that, Sarah. I smiled, feeling that finally a new chapter was beginning. That day, not only did I get my career back on track, but I also regained the peace and justice I so desperately sought. And somehow, I felt like things were finally in the right place.